Thanks for joining me.
Good to be here.
A few shows ago, we had Vancouver Police Chief Jim Chu on, and we were talking about mental health, addiction, and homelessness. And he recognizes that we've wound up in this unfortunate situation where you have a number of people, a lot of them wind up on the downtown east side, they get victimized, and they need help. He's not in a position to say, here's how we restructure things to get them the help. But this is something that you look at. How do we start to create a society where we know that mental health is an issue that has to be addressed at a societal level, but it needs funding?
Yeah.
So
it is underfunded.
How do we get there?
So at the root of the question here is, how do we afford to take better care of one another?
Right.
And we used to be better at it, even though as a society we're actually wealthier today than we used to be. I mean, there's a couple angles to the Chief's question there, which is, at one level, he's pointing to the fact that the way that we are paying for it is very silly. There's a false economy at play. Because we don't spend what we should on prevention and we don't spend what we should on community mental health, we're paying instead through the most expensive form of service possible, which is through the criminal justice system and through other more acute health interventions that actually cost the system much more. So at one level, if we simply stood back and said, look, let's go ahead and make the upfront investment in community mental health and giving people the supports that they need, we may actually save. And more broadly, and this is research we've done at the CCPA, there is a false economy to failing to tackle poverty writ large, and not just mental health and addictions, but that's just one piece of it.
Now, you know as well as I do, there are many people who will say, yeah, but if we do that, we attract more people who are going to come and want to take advantage of that system, and it becomes a downward spiral on its own.
Well, I don't know that people would necessarily come flocking to Vancouver just because we had better treatment for that kind of thing. You sometimes hear this argument about welfare. We can't be more generous with welfare, or all the poor people will come here. In fact, look, as we all know, it's a very expensive place to live, and living on social assistance is extremely difficult. To the extent that there are some interjurisdictional issues, that becomes a leadership challenge to those in government to say, hey, well, if we all recognize that we need more support, and I've put this to government in the past, then do you lead some sort of national conversation about how we do this in a coordinated way? But of course, they don't, not on issues like
Well,
this.
it's on the national stage now.
Yeah. And over the years, I think we've heard a lot of good talk about mental health issues and addiction issues. There was also that recent national study at home, which again highlighted that false economy, that if we fail to house people with mental health and addiction issues, we pay for it in other ways. That said, I think also at root in all of this is that we have undermined our fiscal capacity to pay for things that we should be paying for.
How so?
Well, in this province, we don't collect taxes the way that we used to. And some of what's at play here is the legacy of 10 years of tax cuts, but dating in particular to those sweeping tax cuts that Gordon Campbell brought in when he was first elected in 2001. Let me just give you a couple statistics. If we simply taxed as a province today at the same tax rates that prevailed in the year 2000, the provincial treasury would have $3.5 billion more per year to work with. Now think about that, $3.5 billion, that's double the size of the deficit at the height of the economic downturn in 2008, 2009. Or, a little less ambitious, what if we, instead of boasting about having the lowest taxes in the country, which our government likes to do, what if instead we simply said, let's be average. Let's tax at the average of Canadian provinces. We've looked at that question too, and the answer is the provincial treasury would have about $2.4 billion more per year to pay for the things that we need to better look after each other.
That's just being average.
That's just average. And you know what? The response, maybe I'm jumping your next question, but the response is always, but what would the economic cost be? And I suspect it would be nothing. I think that would be the economic cost to being average. I think there'd be some hooting and some complaining and some squawking. Would it actually result in a decrease in economic activity? I don't think so.
Opponents to this way of thinking will say, but all we have to do is take a look at the record of the NDP government in the late 1990s, and they'll say economic activity was not as robust then as it is now. And maybe I'm jumping your response by saying, are they correct?
They're not correct. And in fact, so don't take my word for it. Interestingly, it was collapsed when Christy Clark became premier. But Gordon Campbell had this progress board. These business leaders who were tasked with annually tracking the progress of the province on all of these indicators, including some leading economic indicators. And one of the things that's interesting about their tracking is that if you hearken back to when all of these taxes were cut, because we used to be average. The promise was that it would catapult us into the lead economically. It simply hasn't happened. On all of those key economic indicators around unemployment, around growth, around capital investment, we are average. And in some cases, worse than average. So it simply hasn't delivered on what it was that it was supposed to deliver on, but we pay for it in other ways. We pay for it through that undermining of our fiscal capacity to pay for other things. But also, that question of the economic benefit there, if we were simply taxing and putting that money in a black hole, that would be a drain on the economy. But if we're taxing and spending it on things that we both need but also are positive to the economy, that's a net gain. And actually often, if you're taxing people, particularly at the higher end of the income ladder, who spend it overseas or save it, and then you're deploying that in the local economy, particularly focusing it on lower income people who don't have the luxury of saving, who spend everything they have in the local economy, you actually get a net boon to your economy.
Because they're reinvesting back in the community that they live in.
The money's staying and circulating. So it's staying and circulating, which is the economic side, but to bring this back to your main point, we're also deciding as a society what's important to us and what we want to spend it on.
So from your perspective, what are we saying right now about the kind of society that we want to have?
I don't think it reflects well on us. And this is actually why I'm so passionate about the question of taxes, because a lot of people, it's their least favorite topic, and I'm a little weird that way. But to me, it strikes right to the question of what are our values and priorities as a society. And very often, there's another issue at the root of the tax question, which is simply because often the rejoinder comes, well, we can't afford it, which is usually the wrong point. Things tend to cost what they cost. And the only question before us is, which are the things that we want to pay for on our own, and which are the things that we want to pay for together? And health writ large is a perfect example. Our public health system, where we have a proven record, particularly compared to the United States, that we pay for these things both more efficiently and more equitably by doing it together. The problem is, our public health care system only applies to the acute care system and visits to our doctors. And community health care, which is so critical to mental health and addictions, isn't covered for the most part by the public health care system.
Why is that?
This is part of the legacy. In many ways, our public health care system is an unfinished dream. Initially it was just going to be insurance for doctor's visits, and we broadened it to include hospitals in the acute care system, but we never covered drugs, and we never covered community health care, and we never covered community health care needs for frail seniors and people with disabilities. But I would say all of those are cases where we would find, once again, that we would provide these things to one another more equitably and more efficiently if we ante-did and did it together.
Do you think that there's an underlying psychological reason as to why we kind of cut the floor at a certain level and said, if you're below it, we're not gonna be there for you?
My feeling on this actually, and it's supported by some polling that we've done, is actually a majority of the public would like to go there. So it's not. I think actually a lot of what I'm saying aligns with the values of the majority of British Columbians and Canadians. The challenge it faces isn't that people don't desire that, it's that they've been convinced that it's not practical or realistic. And because of the arguments we were having before, which is that if we tax this way, rich people would flee or corporations wouldn't invest. And that's where I think you need to just look at the evidence. On the corporate side, this is one of the cheapest places, Vancouver in particular. Mm-hmm. And don't take my word for it. Look at the KPMG surveys that are done and the cost of taxes across industrialized countries. So even if there's truth to the argument, like, is there a point at which if you tax too much, you would actually discourage economic activity and investment?
Well, that's the argument.
So my answer to you is, there is a point, and we're nowhere close to it. So, for example, Piketty, the book who everyone's reading these days, he and his American collaborator, Emmanuel Saez, who, by the time this airs, we just are bringing him to town later this week. They have surveyed across the major industrialized countries, and they find there is a top marginal tax rate at which you can see a decline in economic activity.
And that is?
It's about 80%.
80%?
80%. Our top marginal tax rate now is about 44%. So we got lots of room to move before these economic arguments actually materialize. So these are choices that we make. And those choices create a climate in which people say, I wish we could take better care of one another, but they accept the argument that we can't afford it. And my point is, that's a choice we can make.
How do you think we wound up there?
Well, at a certain point, I think it's been a slow evolution, and I think certain corporations and lobbies lobbied hard for lower taxes. They lobbied hard for trade agreements that create more mobility for capital so that the threat of capital flight ends up having more strength. There's a lot of bluffing that goes on, but there's a little bit of truth.
Wasn't the Fraser Institute created for that very reason? There was this feeling that the direction that we're going in as a country needed a voice that would say we have to go the other way.
Yeah, I'd say they fairly successfully did shift political discourse that opened up this kind of space, and credit to them, I suppose. But here's the caveat I would say. When it comes to our political culture, they convinced much of the public that their policy prescriptions were inevitable, but not that they were desirable. Mm-hmm. Meaning people's values still want to tackle what you opened up this conversation with, which is we want to do a better job looking after one another.
Before we turned on the cameras, we talked about an issue that you say plays a role in this, inequity. What do you mean by that?
When I talk about the need to raise some taxes, it's not just to raise revenues in order to pay for things like housing and community mental health and addiction supports. It's also because the tax question also connects to inequality. A few years ago, there was a very interesting book published called The Spirit Level by a couple British epidemiologists, Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. Mm-hmm. And their basic point was to look at the connections between inequality and a host of social and health ills. So when you plot all of the industrialized countries, one of the things that's interesting is this correlation between inequality and mental health, inequality and addictions. When you compare, say, the United States and Sweden, now the rich are in the United States are much richer than the richer in Sweden.
Yes.
But they have worse health, and they have worse mental health. So across these, whether it's teenage pregnancies, school dropout rates, addictions, mental health, incarceration, homicide, social trust, on all of these indices, the countries with more equality score better. If you were to take all the industrialized countries and you were to plot their level of taxes against their level of economic performance, you know what you would see? A bloody mess. That's what you'd see. There's no connection between taxes and economic performance. But
no connection. Okay, you caught me by surprise.
Between the level of taxation and economic performance. But if you were to plot the level of taxation and the level of inequality, there's a high connection. And in turn, if you were to plot the level of inequality against the level of health problems and addictions and so on, there's a deep correlation there too. So my point is, if you really want to go upstream on these questions of mental health and addictions, part of it is tackling inequality itself. The more unequal a society is, it produces a kind of psychosocial stress that's unhealthy to all of us. Not just the poor, the rich too. Let me go back to Gordon Campbell's tax cuts in 2001. If you are in the top 1% of British Columbia households, the value of those tax cuts was really quite juicy. So if you're in the top 1% of households, if we taxed today at the same rate as prevailed in the year 2000, on average, those families would be paying $41,000 more in taxes. If you actually look at all the taxes we pay in BC, and you plot that by income, as we've done, what you see is a downward sloping line, meaning richer people pay more in taxes, but as a share of their income, their percent of taxes is less. The richer you are in BC, the lower your overall tax rate. So that's another piece of all of this, is how do we raise the money, how do we tackle inequality, and how do we restore balance and fairness to the overall tax system?
I had a conversation with a very, very successful mining executive a couple of years ago. I was doing a piece about the success of his career, and he said that they first came to British Columbia in the 1970s, just before Dave Barrett's government came in, and then they went, oh, wasn't expecting that. Okay, well, we'll just wait till there's a change in government, and they made that decision. He said they actually made the decision to invest somewhere else.
Right.
And his argument is, well, and as a result, jobs weren't created, there wasn't a tax base. Is that fair comment on his behalf?
So first of all, I mean, it's worth thinking about this differently in terms of both individuals and businesses. If we reflect back to the last provincial election, interestingly, both the major parties were running on a new tax bracket at $150,000 a year. And my recollection, it was a year and a half ago, of the public reaction to those tax increases was a great big yawn.
I don't recall it being an issue.
It wasn't an issue. But that's my point, that I actually think political culture has shifted once again, and people's understanding that those tax questions are related to the quality of life and public services that are important to us and even important to corporations. To your corporation point, you know, these are smart people when they're making investment decisions, and an awful lot of bluffing goes on in their negotiations with government. I think we're seeing some of that on the LNG front these days.
Well, that's my next question.
Let's go there in a sec. But my point is that I mentioned KPMG before. They do these surveys of the cost of doing business across all of these countries. One thing they find is that, in fact, BC and Vancouver is one of the least expensive tax regimes, and so we have room to move. But the other point that KPMG always finds with these surveys is that if you're a business person deciding where to invest, taxes is only one piece of the equation. You're interested in the quality of the labor, you're interested in proximity to markets, you're interested in the cost of electricity, you're interested in a whole list of things, of which taxes comes number 7 or 8 on the list. So my feeling generally is, if we look to our governments to negotiate a good deal on our collective behalf with corporations, and I think they've done a crappy job of that.
So were you aghast when you saw the provincial government's reaction to the maneuvering of Petronas in particular, but the LNG sector?
I think they've negotiated terribly. They had hung so much political capital on landing these plants that, and of course, these are very sophisticated companies who can see that and name their price. And I think we saw the results of that. I wouldn't say I was aghast. I think it was all fairly predictable train wreck.
But if we draw the circle back to where we started about homelessness and mental health, if we keep doing deals like this, how does that help us get
we're going
back
to be in
here.
big trouble. You know, why is the provincial government budget been so pinched, particularly in recent years? Well, one of the big reasons is the drop off on royalty income from natural gas. But here's the interesting thing. Natural gas production in the Northeast has been at record levels. So we're taking a finite greenhouse gas, we're pulling it out of the ground at record levels that we own together with First Nations. It's ours. It's a public resource. And we're getting nothing for it. Why are we getting nothing for it? We're getting nothing for it because we have a royalty regime that's tied to price, not volume. That's a choice too. Texas doesn't do that. Texas has rents that are tied to volume. How, you know, if you're sucking this much gas out, you're going to pay this. You know, my fear is they're going to go down this road with LNG. They're trying to get this Asian price, and the market doesn't like a price differential like exists between Asia and North America. By the time many of these plants come online, that price is going to converge. And we will have given away the store on the income tax. Embedded in that legislation was also cuts to the corporate income tax that the LNG firms will pay. And the royalty rates, you know, we've seen that story. On the resource side, whether it's natural gas or water or forestry, we are shipping, mining too, all of those areas, we are shipping basic commodities, raw logs and raw waste and minorly processed gas.
We've been doing that for more than 100 years.
Yeah, you'd think we'd know better by now. And I don't think that's the way for the future.
Do you have hope at the moment? Because the way you spell it out, if I read you correctly, you see it getting worse.
I'm both worried and hopeful. I mean, when you look at inequality trends, we all know things have gotten worse in over 30 years. But the scary part is what happens 20 years from now. If the trends continue, then the inequality picture becomes much worse 20 years, and we have a 1% who culturally no longer live in the same society as the rest of us. And that's a problem. And it's stressful, and it's bad for our mental health, and it's bad for their mental health. But I take solace in some of those values and opinions I spoke of earlier. Those core values have remained remarkably resilient through all of these pendulum shifts.
Well, it'll be very interesting to see how we collectively respond to this in the coming years, because it will shape the kind of society that we'll call home. Thank you very much for doing this.
Thanks, Jim. Okay.